Hello, everyone. We're going to be starting momentarily. Thank you all for joining us. We've got a bunch of people popping in. You might hear some Beyonce in the background. We can all use Beyonce in our lives. All right, let's get started. All right. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. It's titled Partnering with Families in Education Amidst COVID-19 and Racial Reckonings. And we're so very excited to be connecting with all of you. And just thank you for taking time out of what we know are really busy schedules to just be present with us for the next 90 minutes. I'll start first by introducing myself. I'm Keith Catone. I serve as the director of the Center for Youth and Community Leadership in Education, otherwise known as CYCLE, at Roger Williams University in the greatest and smallest state of Rhode Island. And I have the honor and privilege of moderating today's conversation among some incredible researchers, practitioners, and leaders who have contributed to 3 important books focused on parent and family leadership, organizing, and transforming schools into the places where the wisdom of families of color in particular is held, lifted up, and followed. They will each get a chance to introduce themselves and their work in a bit, but I can't say enough about how awesome it is to have the opportunity to learn today with Ann Ishimaru, Joanna Geller, Sue Hong, Keisha Scarlett, Sonia Lennox, Wendy Perez, Luva Alvarez, and Megan Lucas, who are all here with us today and pictured on the flyer. So as we get started, I'd like to go over a few things, our agenda and some housekeeping. So as you know, the webinar is guided by the key insights from these 3 new books, all focused on engaging families through an education justice lens. Through a moderated panel discussion and then breakout sessions followed by a short Q&A, we hope to illuminate promising strategies for engaging families, communities, and educators looking to make systems change, especially in the context of COVID-19 and racial reckonings nationwide. The strategies we're going to talk about today are rooted in a community organizing framework that moves beyond conventional deficit-based parent involvement and engagement models to emphasize one-on-one relationships, leadership development, and building power. But first, some housekeeping. One, you should have seen as you came into the main session that we are recording this session. We will be sharing the recording with those who registered but who are unable to make it today, either due to space constraints or just other things that came up. And we'd also like to encourage those of you on Twitter or Instagram to share what you are learning using the hashtag FamiliesLead and tag the authors, which maybe if someone can put that in the chat, at prof_Ishimaru, at Sortle. It's much easier if we actually put this in the chat, at Metro_Research, and at Cycle_RWU. We'll get that out for folks in the chat. Here it comes from Lee. Thank you. And right now, most of you should have your camera off. The best way to view this webinar will be to have your meeting set to gallery view. So right now, if you see an option in the upper right of your Zoom screen, if it says speaker view, you are in gallery view. If it actually says gallery view up there, click that, and then you will move to gallery view. Another trick that will be helpful is to also hide non-video participants, which you can do right now by clicking on any non-video participants, so you'll just see someone's screen name. So right now, for instance, Ann Ishimaru is off video and I see her on my screen. If I click on her name, I can actually get an option to hide non-video participants. And if I do that, the only people you see are those with their videos on, and right now it looks like that's just me. And that's going to help us out throughout to just maintain focus on the speakers and actually do a little icebreaker in a moment. When we're in the main session, please remain muted while we have our panel discussion and the audience Q&A. That will minimize background noise and feedback and allow us to hear everyone as clearly as possible. And when we go into breakout sessions, there may be some limited opportunity to unmute and share your questions or perspectives with our featured speakers and each other. That will sort of depend on how large the breakouts are looking now, like there'll be about 50-ish folks. In terms of breakouts, we're going to randomly assign, and we know that folks, when you registered, you may have indicated a preference, but because we got way more interest than initially anticipated, doing the pre-assigning in breakouts for a meeting this large is too difficult, actually not supported by Zoom. And so we just ask for your understanding about this, and I'll remind everyone, if you absolutely want to join a specific breakout and you get randomly assigned to one that's not that one, then you can leave and return to the main session when we get to that point, and we will reassign you. And then finally, we want you to engage in the Zoom chat to share resources and what resonates. So the Zoom chat function, that's for kind of chatter on the side, like that's a great point, me too. We have, we're doing something like this, here's a link. Different kinds of things to be able to share with each other. And then we're going to use something called Slido for a different function to submit your questions and to answer a poll question that we'll have coming up. So you'll see on the slide right here, you can go to slido.com and when prompted, enter the hashtag partnerfams, as you can see on the screen, and that will get you into the Slido Slido room, so to speak, for this session. That's something that's operating separately from Zoom, and so if you have two devices, for instance, if you're on your computer for Zoom, you could use your phone for Slido. You can toggle back and forth if you are on your computer or just have one device. If you're doing that, I recommend you escape out of the full screen mode that you might be in right now on your computer so that you can toggle between two different applications or sort of windows on your computer. But if you do that, then you can answer poll questions. You can take a moment to join now. And also, there's a QR code on the screen. If you hold your phone camera up to that, it will take you there automatically if your phone is as smart as mine. So that is the housekeeping. And we're going to jump right into an icebreaker. So most of you have your cameras off, which is awesome, because for this icebreaker, we're going to ask you to kind of say hello, muted, but say hello by video based on our role. So choose to hide non-video participants, as it looks like folks have done. And keep your videos off for now, and then I'm going to do a roll call through different roles of people who might be here today. So if the role applies to you, turn on your video feed, and we'll all be able to see who pops up and get a bit of a sense of who's with us today. So we'll try this out. If you are a teacher, a classroom teacher, or please turn your video on. Look at this. Say hello. Wave to each other. Wave to the people watching you. Take a bow. Y'all are in it right now. Some of you are literally in it, depending on which part of the country you're from. And some of you are anticipating what it means to be in it as we reopen schools. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Much love to our teachers. All right, turn your videos off. And although some of you might want to keep your video on, if you are a parent or caregiver, turn your video on if you are a parent or caregiver. Here we go. You may have to scroll now to see. If you see now, we've got 3 pages at least on my screen of people. Wave, everyone. Wave, wave. Say hello to each other. Virtual hugs and pounds. There we go. So I got 4 pages now. Scroll through. Keep waving. Keep waving. Someone's taking a big gulp of coffee. This is great. This is great. Say hello to your fellow parents and caregivers. All right. You can turn them off unless you are a school administrator. So school administrators, who do we have with us? School administrators. We're popping in. I see some switching around here. Here we go. A couple pages worth of school administrators. Wave. Keep waving. Keep waving. This is just like those of you who might have watched the DNC last night. I am no Kamala, but it sort of feels like that right now. All the people on the screen that were waving to her. So thank you. And we're gonna next go with organizers, community organizers or community nonprofit workers. So if you work in a community-based organization, put your camera on. All right. We got a couple pages. Scroll to see the next page. I see the beautiful waves. We can tell. Look at this. Look at this. We got some good strong waves, some pageant waves. Give me a float wave. Who does a float wave? Anyone? There we go. There we go. Nice. Nice. Looking good. Beautiful. Beautiful people. Two more. Family community outreach workers. So folks who are frontline, it's your job to liaise. These are parent liaisons. These are maybe community school coordinators. These are folks who are in your nonprofit or school settings you are the ones who are building those direct relationships with parents as your primary function. Very nice. Very nice. Say hello. Say hello. Awesome. I love it. I love it. All right. And then last but not least, education or any kind of researchers. Who's doing research? And you could be a community-based researcher. You don't have to be based in a university. So who's doing research out in the world? You could be school-based, community-based, but who identifies with a research hat every now and then? And take a wave, take a bow. Here we go. Awesome. All right. That was kind of fun. If you're in a large meeting, encourage you to try that out with other participants. I'm going to ask if you are a panelist to put your camera on, but if you are not a panelist, to turn your camera feed off. And we're going to jump right in. All right. So reminder about Slido. If you just joined us while we were doing the waving, you can join Slido. This is for submitting questions for our Q&A later, or to respond to a poll question that we'll be posting later on in the session. And so you can go to slido.com and enter the hashtag partnerfams, or put your smartphone up to the QR code, that's that black and white thingy, square, and you can join from there. So please do that, and then we'll jump into our panel for the first question, which is a simple one. It's, can you each introduce yourselves and give us a brief 1-minute introduction to the books you wrote? And we're going to start with Anne and her book, Just Schools.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Such an honor to be with all of you, to see lots of familiar faces and also some new folks. I'm Anne Ishimaru, coming to you from the lands of the Duwamish and the Coast Salish peoples. I'm a researcher and faculty member at the University of Washington in Seattle. And my research focuses on the leadership of both families and communities in educational justice work, and also the leadership of formal leaders in schools and school systems. I have 3 kids, one or more of whom you may see pop in here. And I'm Yonsei, or 4th generation Japanese American. My grandparents were incarcerated during World War II, and that shapes a lot of the upbringing and commitments that shape the work that I do. So as you probably know, Just Schools is my book. It's about building equitable collaborations with families and communities. And in brief, it's really about thinking about how we can rethink and reshape our model of family engagement, especially as we think about families of color and working class families. The book focuses on how we might center those families and recognize them as fellow educational leaders, especially in this moment, but also moving forward. And that conventional model is really focused on thinking about how do we get parents or families or caregivers to do something that schools, that's related to kind of school-centered expectations. And so a lot of what I kind of unpack in the book is how those expectations are normed on individualistic white middle-class expectations, and they are well-intentioned, but they often can reinforce the racial inequities that already exist in schools. So even those well-intended efforts sometimes can do the opposite of what we intend. And so, well, across the different chapters of the book, I really talk about how we can think through 4 different principles to help us leverage the expertise of those families and reshape the way that we approach them by beginning with their priorities and assets, by thinking about how to transform power in the relationships, how to build reciprocity and agency, and how to undertake change as a kind of collective inquiry at various different levels, whether it's from classroom, in and out of schools, and into communities.
Thank you, Anne. We're going to move over to Joanna Geller and the ripple effect.
Hi, everybody. It's fantastic to be here. I'm Joanna Geller. I'm the Assistant Director of Research at the NYU Metro Center. And I'm also honored to be joined on this panel with Luva Alvarez, who is with the Greater Rochester Parent Leadership Training Institute. So Luva and I today are representing the book, The Ripple Effect in Action. And the Ripple Effect in Action is based on a participatory evaluation project that we at NYU Metro Center led in collaboration with 7 incredible parent leadership organizations nationwide, as well as an organization called Dialogues in Action. So for those who don't know, participatory evaluation is when the people who are closest to a program or organization are deeply involved in deciding how it should be evaluated, and then in this case, really carrying out every aspect of the evaluation. So teams of parent leaders and staff from these 7 parent leadership organizations conducted interviews with a total of 169 parent leaders, the majority of whom were Black and Latinx women, many of whom were immigrants, to answer 2 research questions. So the first was, what are the impacts of parent leadership initiatives on the parents who experience them? And then the second question was, what are common successful practices of these initiatives? So the teams of parent leaders and staff in collaboration with their communities analyzed the data that they collected from the interviews, and then each organization actually wrote a chapter of this book. And our staff at NYU Metro Center synthesized the findings across the organizations to see what common themes stood out. So that's the project that we'll be sharing about today.
Thank you, Joanna. And finally, Sue Hung and her book, Natural Allies.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here in conversation with you all today. So I'm joined here with Megan Lucas, who is featured in my book, Natural Allies. And so I'm an associate professor of education at Wellesley College. And as a researcher, I'm interested in the intersection between families and the schools that educate their children. I'm a sociologist of education, so my work is ethnographic in nature usually. And one of the things that that drove me or motivated me to write at Natural Allies is my first identity in education. I mean, I guess my first identity technically is as a student, but I started my career as an educator. So I was a classroom teacher, an elementary and middle school teacher. And I think that one of the things that I really always had questions about as a teacher was how we as educators build the kinds of relationships with our families, the kinds that I always aspired or desired or wanted my teachers to connect with my family in that way. And it just never really happened for me in ways that I felt that educators really truly understood and appreciated my family. And so as a teacher, as a young teacher, that was sort of central to what I was interested in. And I think as a researcher, I've really carried that interest into the work that I do. And so Natural Allies is a series of 5 portraits of teachers that I got to know over a couple years. And it's actually kind of follows in the footsteps of people like Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot. Keith actually wrote a book that was really inspirational when I was working on Natural Allies, which is also, his book was also Portraits of Teacher Activists. So one of the things that I really liked about doing this research was that it allowed me to spend a lot of time with 5 teachers who at the core of their work really were grounded in the appreciation and respect and collaboration and partnership with families. And the thing is, they all had different ways that played out in their classrooms and different ways that it played out in their relationships with families. And so it was really important for us to be able to see different people who are highly motivated to do this work and to see them do this work in different ways. But one of the nice things about being able to get to know people like Megan over a few years in the study was that we could sit down and talk with each other. I could understand not only what it looked like by being in the classroom with her and being with her as she is engaging with families, but to have these longer, sustained conversations about why she's, why this work is important to her, what it means to her, and to also be able to have those conversations with families as well. So Natural Allies is really, I wrote the book, but it's really grounded in the stories of these 5 teachers that you get to know and the ways that they connect with and sustain these relationships with families.
Awesome. And I actually jumped to Joanna before Anne had a chance to introduce one of her co-authors. And so I want to just back up real quick for that.
Thanks. Apologies. I just want to do a quick introduction of Dr. Keisha Scarlett, who is at Seattle Public Schools as is it chief? Is that right? Of Equity Partnership and Engagement, and she is a co-author and an active partner in especially around the systems-based co-design.
Awesome. Thanks to all of you for all your work, the writing and the work that you're doing with real people, real parents, real educators. And I know that's where everyone's hearts are. So we're going to jump right into the thick of things. And, our webinar sub-theme was naming that we're doing this work right now in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the racial reckonings of our country's legacy of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And we all know that when it comes to family-school partnership, that trust is key. And in this moment, educational institutions, which have historically broken trust with communities of color and Black communities in particular, are asking families to trust them when it comes to school reopenings, and in some cases, newly proclaimed commitments to equity and anti-racism. So what can your work and research teach us about how to develop trust between educators and families in such challenging circumstances? And we're going to stay with the Natural Allies work and start with Sue.
I think this is a question that's on all of our minds right now. And I think you've certainly tuned in to this Zoom meeting because you care about this. And it's at the forefront of our minds right now. So one of the things that I learned through my work as a teacher, honestly, and also through the research in Natural Allies, one of the motivating factors was that we don't, as educators and schools, we don't really know families very well. And I think that oftentimes we think we know families well because we have maybe given them information or talked about the ways that we want them to support their children. I know that if you're a parent right now, you've probably received some forms and surveys from your school district. And sometimes, like school districts, or educators think that by giving out forms and ways for parents to share their feedback or caregivers to share their experience, that's a relationship. But it's not a relationship, and it's not even really fully knowing families in the experiences that they have and the kinds of struggles that they endure and the aspirational ways that they see their children. And so one of the things that became clear to me in doing this work is that we don't know families. And I was interested in figuring out and kind of breaking bread with teachers who were clearly getting a sense of families. We also don't know how to, so not only do we not know families, we also don't know how to engage them oftentimes. And so like the survey and the forms or the information sessions, like parents and family members often feel like they're being spoken to or talked at without really feeling as if their experiences are being shared or that they're being heard or listened to. And so I think that we need to figure out ways to, how do we engage families? And I think part of the reason why we don't know how to do that, and part of the reason why I didn't know how to do that when I was a new teacher, was that it was, family and community engagement if it's at the margins, we're lucky. It's often invisible. And so in training teachers and training school administrators, it's really something that we put on the back burner. We don't really think of it as an essential practice and something that we need to understand and know how to do. And I think that the real shortcoming in all of this, and we see this, I think this moment really shows us that it's not so much that it reveals that it's worse than we expected, but I think that it reveals us, it really lays bare that we have some problems around institutional racism, bias and prejudice against families. And so this moment is really showing us that we need educators and families to be connected and to do this work together, but we're working in a broken system that has, historically harmed our Black and brown families in particular, our immigrant and refugee families. And so we haven't really ever built those kinds of relationships. And one of the things that I learned from the teachers and natural allies is that for them, engaging families is so central to their work as teachers, and it allows them to kind of understand how to be better teachers, but also to appreciate and understand the beauty of families. And each of these teachers does that in their own ways, but it's all kind of centered on this relationship and trust building, so that you can't really get to know people and understand them until you're in conversation with them and you understand their stories and the experiences that they have, and that you yourselves kind of can make yourself vulnerable so that families can come and share their stories with you too.
Thank you, Sue. Anne, how do we build trust right now in a Just Schools framework?
I think this is a really powerful question, because I think one of the things that can happen is, even at the beginning of that question, we can forget that mistrust that exists, especially amongst many families of color, is very well warranted. And then if we come at it with a kind of absence of a recognition of the histories of colonization and oppression, then and sort of imagine that there's a fresh, clean slate, we are fooling ourselves as folks who are trying to build these relationships and to foster leadership. When Sue and Joanna and I came together and thought about how our books fit together and complemented each other really nicely, one of the things that we realized is that Sue just talked about relationships. Joanna's going to talk about leadership. One of the things that's really central to my book is about power. And so I think one of the things that we need to do is kind of first off, recognize that some of these things that are coming to light aren't new. So the systemic racism, which now has become much more part of the mainstream conversation, has a really long, deep history, and it shapes our interactions in the everyday moment. And even it shapes how we can think about what are the possibilities moving forward. And so we have a tendency sometimes to think about schools as the kind of panacea. And one of the narratives that I'm going after quite a lot these days is this narrative of learning loss, and that it presumes that uniformly kids being at home with their families is harmful. And it's not to say that there aren't children who are in precarious situations. Schools do play a really important role, but especially for Black and Indigenous and other children of color, schools are also places of harm historically, and then in ongoing ways as well. And so I think as we think about trying to build trust, it's first off sort of acknowledging that mistrust that exists is very well warranted, and that we have to actually reckon with where that mistrust comes from. It comes out of a long history of institutions and schools exerting power over families and communities. And so I think that rather than always one small way that we can begin to disrupt that and to own those legacies is to actually shift from always talking about learning loss to also asking questions of families, not just about what you don't have or what the challenges and what the needs are. Yes, those are important. Also, let's think about and find out about what are families already doing? What are they already learning? What do they already know? What is the brilliance of their children? And how do we begin the conversation from that place as a small move to begin to acknowledge those legacies and the ways in which we need to shift on the part of systems.
Thank you, Anne. And folks, check out the chat as we're sharing here. Some people are sharing some ideas and just what resonates. We encourage you to share resources. Lee Hilford, if you scroll up, shared links to all of the books that we're talking about. If you want to pull them up, you can do that as well. So finally, on this question, Luva, could you give us your perspective on the challenges of building trust in this moment?
So I would agree. Well, first of all, thank you for having me and being part of this panel. This is a great conversation. This is also a great question. As a parent, living this whole thing right now, it's hard. You know, it's really hard to really figure out what is the best decision that we want to do for our children and what to do and who to trust. I think what has to happen is that our educators and families, or educators in particular, have to really be intentional in building community, building relationships. They have to, you know, they have to be able to build that relationship from day one. It has to be an honest one. It has to be a one that's straight talk. You know, so often I think educators or people who are in that role sometimes forget that, you know, that they're humans, right? And we just regular people can just have regular conversations to build on relationships. And I think it's about relationships. You know, it's very important that we acknowledge, how do we do that? How does that step come in? And that step comes in from day one, really learning about the families that you're connecting with, that you have in your classroom, that you are having a conversation with, really honestly understanding where they come from, their backgrounds, right? Because not everybody that's in that and that you're meeting all have the same backgrounds or all have the same upbringings, you know? So it's really about just understanding them and building that relationship from day one. And then just like being transparent, that's very important. You know, I think families want educators or people in that space to be transparent to them, you know, be honest. And so I think once we see that as a parent, then that trust begins, and then we begin that process of building relationships, and then we start having that effective communication that we want.
Awesome. So also kind of embedded in that question was this maybe a slightly snarky from me, this newly proclaimed commitments to equity and anti-racism, right? So, you know, we've all lived through diversity was the jam, and then folks were like, yeah, we got to be inclusive. And then we realized, we being broader society, maybe we should talk about equity. Some folks, and then folks started talking about justice a little bit, maybe once equity kind of lost its flair. And now all of a sudden, you know, on at least some like semi-progressive places, we're talking about anti-racism, which is a win in some respects, right? But also is potentially anxiety-inducing, perhaps, for many of us who have been doing work in the anti-racism arena for a long time. And so I would love y'all to comment on and say more about how families in particular, right? How families can, should, and have been at the center of driving and leading us to real anti-racist education systems. in this vein of family leadership, parent leadership, this is not a new conversation for many, many, many parents of color, right? So how do we lean on that? How can we? What examples do we have? What work has been doing? What do we do to sort of lean on and acknowledge the leadership and wisdom that families possess if we really are about it when it comes to anti-racist education? And Keisha, we're gonna lay that on you, being the chief of all this out in Seattle.
Yeah, so I think taking the cue from Anne and just talking about this in terms of power, we have to acknowledge that dominant families have always been at the center of driving racist education systems. So how do we sort of flip that question around into like what has existed before? They have been able to organize in ways to push agendas that replicate and sustain opportunity hoarding for their children. And so nothing has changed in that. And, you know, our families of color, particularly BIPOC families, have been driving anti-racist change for a long time also, sort of as a counter to that as well. So a couple things that makes me think about the can and should part of that question also is about power. And so one of my commitments as to how can I as a systems leader give away my sort of seat of power and open it up to families and students and communities who have been pushed to the margins of our systems, move them into the center and sort of give away my power and whatever that looks like for those that I lead, and also encouraging other people who purport to want to lead in racially equitable ways or leading for anti-racism to do the same. And so that point about giving away power is an acknowledgement of the positional power that I hold even in the system. Even though I am an African-American woman leading in the system, but also is an opportunity to have entry points to be able to shift that power. So that whole idea about can and should drive all of us, I'm going to say at the systems leadership level, that families can drive anti-racist education systems change, and they should do it. And so they should be empowered. So one of the things I'm thinking about families right now, that amid pandemic and these virtual environments that we quickly pivoted to, all of a sudden we found resources to do the impossible. And so we have all of these computers in homes. One way that families can drive anti-racist systems change is the opportunity now that education will be deprivatized in their homes and in community spaces, that children are going to be linked on to computers for synchronous learning. And so we're able to see what instruction looked like in ways that we never were able to before. It was been a black box in many cases for many families, particularly those families who are not invited or who are actually pushed away and kept away from access to that. So then how might we work with families and community leaders to develop sort of these instructional frameworks for us to be able to empower families to be able to view instruction and to be able to give feedback about what's happening and to know what's happening in there and what is of the education that aligns with their values and what they want their students to be able to learn as well. So those are ways that we can support giving access to power for families and communities. And so that whole thought about the can families do it? This is a matter of will, about systemic will. Are we really willing to act in anti-racist ways, which are shifts in power as well? And so us being able to really grapple with that as systems leaders from the top of leadership all the way throughout the system, and even think about classroom educators. Do you think that it is a great opportunity that families are able to say, you know, view instruction that you're giving to students? Are you inviting them to give their perspectives and give their feedback on that? Becomes very important. So you have to ask yourself, if you want to lead for anti-racism as a classroom teacher, as a school leader, to what degree are you willing to shift power?
Thank you, Keisha. So much in there, so much in the chat that folks are resonating with. Thank you, folks, for engaging in that way as well. Keep on doing it. Megan, do you want to add your perspective to this conversation about how families can, should, and have been at the center of driving and leading us to an anti-racist education system?
Sure. I'm more than happy to add to the conversation, but frankly, so much of what has been shared is so powerful and compelling. So it's important maybe to name that when I was featured in Sue's book, I was a kindergarten and first grade teacher at Stanton Elementary School in Southeast DC. I'm no longer an educator. I'm currently the Senior Director of Product Development at the Flamboyant Foundation, and I'm also a mother of two. Something we say frequently at Flamboyant is that teachers are the experts on curriculum and pedagogy, but families are the experts on kids. And so I'd offer that one concrete way that families can, and frankly always have been, leading us to anti-racist education systems is that they tell us about the kids. But I think a lot of the time educators and education systems haven't been willing to listen. I know that as a young teacher, I often fell into the trope of a white savior. I can remember times avoiding conversations with families because I felt like they already had too much on their plates. I eventually recognized the white supremacist patronizing stance that truly was, but that was only through deep empathetic listening and relationship building with my students and families. To do those things, we have to challenge our assumptions, our biases, and frankly, our deficit beliefs about families. And that's a foundational part of, I think, any real family engagement practice, and one clear way that we can start to make way for families to listen and be able to truly partner in their students' education.
Thank you. And Joanna, what else can you add here? I think Megan was right. I mean, there's so much richness in what has been said, but what's your take on this?
Yeah, I agree. There's so much that's been said. So I would just add that when we think about an anti-racist education system, it's really important that we think of the anti-racist education that's always happened in communities of color beyond schools. I think that's what Keisha was saying too. So I think back to late May and June, when many schools, and in particular white educators, were struggling with how to talk about racism with their students. And meanwhile, Black families and families of color have always had conversations with their children about race and racism. And at that time, white families were organizing as well, but it was really Black families who were figuring out how to organize digitally, who were leading rallies, who were speaking together at rallies, who were getting protests organized, in 24 hours and bringing huge crowds. And so this goes back to what Anne was saying about the narrative of learning loss. Actually, children during this time and always in families of color were learning a ton. So going back to trust, I would just say schools really need to trust that families have many of the answers already that they're looking for. And part of the definition of trust is a willingness to be vulnerable. So schools asking families for help and admitting that they don't know all of the answers goes a long way towards building trust. Specifically to the Ripple Effect in Action book, within the 7 organizations featured in the book, parents and their children were invited into spaces where their cultures and languages and racial backgrounds were validated and affirmed. Kids got a political education through joining their parents at rallies and in some cases leading the rallies. The organizations featured in this book all have explicit conversations with parents about racism and how systems disadvantage children of color. And we found that those conversations extended into the home, especially among white parents who weren't used to having those types of conversations with their kids. So I would just say that if we invest in parent leadership, which I think we should do for so many reasons, we're also investing in an anti-racist educational system, because anti-racist education does not just happen in schools. It happens first and foremost in families and communities. And then the last thing that I'll say is that I deeply echo what Keisha said about shifting power and what Megan said about listening. We also found in the book that while parent leaders are doing so much to drive an anti-racist education, one of the biggest barriers is that parents of color aren't listened to and heard when they fight for change. So they're often dismissed by public officials, by school staff, and by fellow white parents, as the new podcast, Nice White Parents, shows. So parents of color, I think, know how to create an anti-racist educational system, and now we need to let them lead. And I include myself in that we, as a white parent, we all have a role in this.
Thank you, Joanna. The Nice White Parents podcast. I just listened to the first one. It's hitting me. I just joined the board for the PTA at my son's school, specifically because I knew I wouldn't be the only person of color on the PTA board, because the co-president is a Black woman, and I told her, I was like, you're the reason I said okay to be on the board, and but we're sharing that around. We live in a predominantly white community in terms of our school, so that's hitting. So the last question I'm going to pose, and then we're going to get to the breakout groups. So if each of you have a quick story or vision that you can give us, or sort of help us imagine an answer to this. So help us see what equitable partnership between families of color, schools, districts, and community-based organizations might look like, and how it makes a difference for children and young people. And I think especially, if you can help us imagine in the context of remote school, right? In the context of distance learning or virtual learning or remote schooling or whatever your locality is calling it. How do we see this? What do you see? What can you imagine? And so there's a lot of questions that have been popping up in the queue, and even as folks shared prior to coming on to the webinar, that are naming, like, we're in this sort of new mode of trying to do this work. And so in that, what kinds of reimaginings, or what kinds of imaginings can you share with us? And I warned you would start with you on this, Anne, so I'm going to stick with that.
All right, I'll try to keep it quick because I know we want to have time for our breakout rooms. I think one of the things, and this is that I think has a lot of potential, is and relates to the question that I see a lot of folks posing about sort of like, how do we get teachers to do this kind of outreach? How do we get feedback on our instruction, those kinds of things? And I think that there's a lot of power in positioning teachers in broader inquiry work. And so one of the things that Keisha and I have been partnering on, and is supporting some of the, especially administrators in Seattle right now, is thinking about how do we identify a group of students or families, especially those farthest from educational justice, and actually use the format of the Zoom and do small groups, and we'll be calling them learning circles. And we've been focused especially on African-American families, African-American boys and their families. And starting with a session that's really asking them about what is the brilliance of, share one thing that's about the brilliance of your child that you want us to know. Tell us something about what you all have been learning and doing during this time, and then help us think about and imagine what would be affirming to your child and to your family in terms of the kinds of teaching and learning that would be happening this time. And I think that that's kind of a starting place, and that we don't have any one-offs though, so that we think about these as ongoing mechanisms. We identify the places where folks are already in conversation with each other. Dr. Scarlett can probably speak to this in our breakout room, for example, discovering that there are whole networks on WhatsApp, for example, for some of the immigrant communities. So they're already in conversation with each other. And so how do we identify what those are, and how do we build from those things? And how do we open those conversations, and then make sure that we are following through and actually doing some of those things, and then coming back, so that we never do the one-off and then always come back.
Thanks. And Joanna, give us an idea, an imagining, a vision.
So one of the most consistent findings across studies of parent leadership, which definitely emerged in our work and the work of Anne and Sue, is that parents develop this sense of collective responsibility, where they stop being concerned just with their own child, but develop a desire to act on behalf of all children. And, you know, Keisha mentioned opportunity hoarding. And I think this sort of desire, this need, this urgency to act on behalf of all children is so critical right now. So, you know, the organizations in the book, they took actions that resulted in amazing concrete policy changes. So for example, an organization, Kofi in Illinois, won 150 community schools in Chicago. They created a statewide parent-peer ambassador model, which has been hugely successful during the pandemic in terms of getting resources, including Chromebooks, out to families across the state. In Mississippi, Parents for Public Schools, parents worked with the Chevron plant, where many parents worked to hold parent-teacher conferences there rather than at the school, so that they could be more accessible to parents. So I think a lot of times in the parent leadership conversation, we focus sort of on these wins and these innovations, which are really, really important. And they make me hopeful. But I would say what makes me equally hopeful are the deep personal changes that parents experienced as a result of being leaders. So we found that parents in these organizations felt a deep sense of belonging. They described a life-changing process where they went from the sense of isolation and powerlessness, much like I think many of us are feeling now, to feeling a sense of self-worth and self-love. This feeling that they had a second family among the other parent leaders and the staff of the organizations. A huge, overwhelming percent of parents reported that they improved their mental, physical, or emotional health. They improved their family situation, their financial situation. About half reported that they furthered their education, that they furthered their career. So to me, this is really what equitable partnership means. It means that, you know, I think school districts right now are thinking so much about what families need and are reaching out to families in really new and creative ways to make sure that their needs are being met. So this is sort of like the promise of public schools. And I think districts are doing an amazing job with that. I would encourage a lot of districts and schools, as they're reaching out to families, to think about what they need, to also think about how these same families can lead, because it's not a false dichotomy between need and leadership. Families can be in need and can be supported while they're also being leaders, and leadership can be a really healing and restorative process in itself.
Thank you, Joanna. We're gonna close this question out in the moderated session here with Sue, and any kind of picture you want to paint for us, being the portraitist that you are. What can we see? What can you help us see?
I think when I think back on my experience as a researcher for the Natural Allies Project, one of the pictures and images that keeps coming back to me is when I would meet and talk to these families that were working with Megan or with Annie Shaw or Cynthia Colon in my book. And one of the things that I heard repeatedly from them was that prior to their experience with these teachers, they didn't have good relationships with teachers. And when I asked them about those kinds of relationships, I really understood from them that when families are not participating or involved in the way that schools want them to, it's not because they don't care or because they don't understand how to do that work or because they don't want to support their children. But time and time again, I heard from families who were kind of resistant to teachers, who were making assumptions about them, who were judging them, who were mistreating and harming their children. So their lack of involvement was in some ways like a way of protecting their children. And I think that as a young teacher, I would have loved to have known that, but I didn't. As someone who didn't have kids myself and was like a young 23-year-old starting out in the classroom, I didn't have a language or a concept for why, if I made outreach efforts to families and they weren't met with enthusiasm or a lot of participation, I just didn't have enough to understand why that would be. I could kind of go back into my own autobiography and my own story and think about the ways that, you know, when my parents had trouble making it, I could imagine, you know, I knew why, like they were working in the evening, or, you know, they were uncomfortable speaking English. There were ways that I could imagine based on my own experience. But I think that, like, this is why the stories of families is so important and has to be so central in everything we do. And I mean, you know, including when we are training teachers to become amazing teachers who are practicing, you know, who are grounded in culturally sustaining pedagogies. Like, families, they're not just decoration in a room. Like, their story shouldn't be just part of a family history project or kind of splashed on the wall. Like, I think that every teacher, you know, if you're committed to doing the work in an anti-racist way, then you have to be committed to building that relationship and getting to know every single one of those families. And sometimes it's going to be hard because these families have past experiences that they may not kind of see you in a positive light, or they may not have reason to trust you. And so, you know, if I know that someone doesn't trust me, I understand I have to work hard to gain that trust. And so that's why it really sometimes frustrates me when, you know, people give up so easily. You know, I prepared for these parent-teacher conferences, or I did everything I was supposed to do, and then no one showed up. And so I guess, you know, it's just not going to work. And I think that, like, we really have to fundamentally understand that thought process, like, we have to shift those mindsets, because that's a really problematic way and a very entitled and privileged way to look at the families in your classroom, to say, I did the work, so now you have to do the rest. And I think what I really understood by getting to know people like Megan is that it's hard work sometimes. And you have to persist, and you can't give up, because you can't give up on these, you know, you would never want to give up on these kids, so you can't give up on their families. And so it's kind of goes back to something that I heard an organizer from LA say a long time ago: you can't love the children if you don't love the family. And I think that we really have to teach people to understand how to love the family.
Thank you, Sue. Sue's book was a gift that it's a gift, period. And then it was also an actual gift that I gave my elementary school principal at the holidays last year. So have to get all your books to gift over there. So we're gonna move into the breakout rooms. First, if you're on Slido, folks have started to answer this question, and it will create a word cloud for us. So if, as we're moving into breakout rooms and throughout, you can answer this question if you're on the Slido application or site. So what aspect of engaging families are you most focused on right now? So clearly we have a large focus on the issue of power that folks are naming, but throw in what you're trying to really capture or think about, the short phrases and words, and that word cloud will continue to get built as we move. We're slightly behind on time, so we're going to move into breakout groups in just a moment, and probably spend about 15 to 20 minutes in those, so we have a time to kind of come back together for some closing thoughts. As we do this, reminder, because we had such a large interest, it was hard to do we couldn't pre-assign breakout groups, so we're going to do that randomly now. So you're gonna just ask for your understanding and patience with that. You should be getting an invitation to join a breakout room. So click that to join. And if you absolutely want to join something different, you can leave it and come back, and then the host, the moderator, will try to we'll talk to you about trying to push in to the room that you want to be in. So folks should be doing that now. Okay, anyone who's still left in here, if you want to either chat, if there's a specific room you're trying to join, you can chat that now. And Lee Hilford, who you may have seen posting, she's assigning people to rooms. You can do that, chat her privately or just chat it and we'll get you there. Or if you want to just come off mute real quick and say where you want to go, that's fine too. There's just a handful of us. Shannon, I told Lee that you wanted to be in Sue's, so you should be getting that invitation. Hi, Cynthia. Are you looking to be in a particular room? You're on mute. You can go off mute and we can just chat. Oh, wait, maybe you can't go off mute. Hold on. Oop.
Yeah, the Just Schools with Anne.
Okay, cool. I don't know if Lee, I don't know if you can hear us, but can you put Cynthia Soto in Anne's breakout, Just Schools? I think you should get an invite. Yeah. Do you have a new invitation, Cynthia? No? should come. I don't know if there's a delay. Zoom can be a little wonky sometimes. Good. Welcome back, folks. People are popping in. Sort of fun just to see people pop up on something like this. It's like, you know, some form of social interaction these days. We are gonna, close up in about 10 minutes. If you are not a panelist or speaker, could you please hide your video? And that will allow folks to concentrate on the panelists in terms of their screens if you're not viewing non-video participants. So thank you for that. Yeah, I hope the breakout sessions you got to go a little bit deeper and folks got to pose a few questions from the panel. Thumbs up. Was there conversation happening? Some deeper things? What do we think? I'm just looking at y'all stare. Anything? Thumbs up? Yes? No? Good. Thanks, Joanna. I was looking at the submitted questions. We've got a few, and they're still coming in. And obviously, we don't have enough time to really go deep into one of them and into all of them rather. But there were some themes around, and I'm just sort of lay things out. And if in terms of the panel, if folks want to pop in on certain ones, just sort of go, right? So there are questions about implementation, right? So just in implementation in this remote context, and I think, but we addressed some of that. But if there's more to say about what do we do? What do we do? A lot of the folks on the call have jobs to do tomorrow in the next 10 minutes, right? Literally before this call, I was on the phone with the principal of my child's elementary school because she was calling to confirm our distance learning versus in-person preference that the district's in a survey about, right? And she's making calls today. So people are doing work right now. So if there are things to kind of do, The other piece I think gets more into the other theme that I saw was really thinking about the role for Black, Indigenous people and people of color folks, and how are we? There were two angles to this, right? So, A, BIPOC folk are way more likely to be asked to be doing the ones doing this work, right, in the community and out of the schools, right, emanating from the schools and within the community. It often falls on BIPOC folks to be the ones who interface and build relationships with families. So how do we address sort of that extra tax that's there on folks, and this sort of like secondary piece to that, which I think is related, which is the notion that BIPOC families need to be taught how to be in our schools, or how to best be in our schools, as opposed to the other way around for our, teaching our schools how to be, right? And so, and I think those are connected, right? Because they send folks that look like folks to go tell them folks that they need to be like these other folks, if you could follow what I just said. And there's this sort of cycle. So how do we kind of think about that? And so I'll stop there. Sort of like, so there's this bigger question around the role of race, really, in this work, and how it moves in these different directions and different vectors, and this real practical, what do we do to implement strategies in the next 10 minutes when folks are off this call and gotta go back to work. So who wants to take a stab?
Well, I'll jump in and get us started. How about? One, I think, just to kind of go back to the nice white parents piece, and just recognizing and holding that that's right. The BIPOC, both parents and staff often are the ones who are having to do the heavy lift on these things. And so like that's a kind of tension in the work, because on the one hand, they also hold expertise that our systems are lacking, but also recognizing it can't always and doesn't have to be an individual endeavor. So what does it mean to build coalitions and to identify and build from the existing coalitions that are already there? I think often when we talk about engagement, it's kind of like what Joanna was saying earlier. People go, oh, well, we have all these disengaged parents. It's like, well, wait a minute, what are all these people doing on the street? They're marching and they're organizing to decriminalize our schools. That's engagement too. So I think there's a piece of it there of recognizing that tension, recognizing that those folks are doing heavy lift, and then when I bring back the sort of nice white parents, making visible and naming, and then actually taking responsibility for the ways in which white families have been centered in these conversations. Their voices have been privileged, and so especially for the predominantly white workforce in our schools and systems, what does it mean to take that up, make that visible? And the person in the podcast, I apologize, I forgot her name. She has this near the one of the latter episodes talks about, well, what does it mean? Maybe we actually have to be active in, she calls it suppressing white voices and influence. But I also think about like, what is the role of especially white educators in opening space and making sure the voices that are already there are being heard.
Any other sort of parting thoughts? We have a couple minutes if folks want to chime in on some practical strategies in this time, or or sort of the role that race obviously plays in all of this. And also want to acknowledge we have Sonia and Wendy, so we're a full Brady bunch at the moment. They are also co-authors, and if you were in one of their breakout rooms, you got to hear from them a little bit. But just welcome into this latter half.
I guess one thing I would add is that, I think I'm thinking about this because the current project that I'm working on is a research project that's focused on pre-service teachers, so people who are learning and thinking how to become a teacher. And, I think for most of the 20-something-year-old folks who are going into teaching, they don't have a lot of experience engaging with families. And they don't get that from their teacher education program. And I think that one of the things that was so instrumental to all of the teachers and natural allies is how much they each learned about engaging families by being in conversation and relationship with families, right? And so I think that as teachers train to become educators, we have to find ways to bring families into the center as teacher educators. So teacher educators shouldn't be people just like me with a PhD. Like, I think that it should, I think that when we're educating teachers and training administrators, like, we have to bring community members and families and family members and parents. They have to be front and center in that work. And so I think that, when new teachers go into the classroom, like, there's, that first year of teaching, those students' families shouldn't be the very first ones that they've kind of talked with or been in conversation with. Because I think that oftentimes it is, and they're anxious because they're young. They feel that they're ill-equipped to kind of have these conversations with families. They don't, they probably have imposter syndrome. They feel like they don't know what to say, or they're going to be found out for kind of the novice teacher that they are. And I think that, like, we have to really ensure that they can have those conversations with BIPOC families, so that it should be part of their learning and growing as educators. I also think we're doing family engagement more than we recognize in remote learning. One of the teachers in my book, she and I were talking the other day, and she has had these different kinds of relationships with families this year, because when she Zooms with her second graders, the family members are in the living room, they're in the bedroom, they're in the kitchen, they can hear her, and I think that, like, she really tried to recognize the fact that when we're in remote learning, there's a lot of family engagement going on that we don't even really recognize is happening.
So we're right at 3:30, and that means we're going to bring this to a close. Respect people's time. Thank the panelists. I also want to really give a shout out and lift up and really thank Lee Hilford. Lee has been managing this behind the scenes for the last 90 minutes. And so if y'all can just send, warm vibes Lee's way. I think she's in DC, so send it that way, wherever you are in the world, and give her some thanks in the chat. She's been a superstar behind the scenes. I want to thank all of the panelists. You can see some opportunities here on the screen. Take a screenshot so that you don't lose that. If you're on a Mac, that's Command 4, and then it gives you a little thing, and you can drag it and take a screenshot. If you don't use a Mac, I don't know what to tell you. And yeah, I want to try something, as we have 100+ folks still. So I'm going to unmute all of you, and I want you to just give a round of applause, shouts of appreciation, declarations of your love and for everybody's work. And I'm going to do that right now. And I just want to hear it. And I think it'll be nice for everyone else to hear it, for everyone who's put in so much hard work for today. So here we go.
Woo, thank you.
Thank you. Awesome.
Keep going. Keep going.
You're all rock stars.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank
so much. Oh my God.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
You're awesome.
With love.
Be well.
I learned a lot. Thank you. For allies.
Gracias.